The first lithology and grain size interaction tutorial showed how to disable varying lithology widths, modify the default width, and update grain size scale labels. This tutorial will go into the gory details of a project's grain size scheme, its grain size scale, and how they work together to vary lithology widths. If you want to create your own grain size scheme and scale, keep watching. If the CSD facility default grain size scheme is sufficient for your project, you can safely skip this tutorial. So let's start by looking at the CSD facility grain size scheme in Scheme Editor. So I've already opened Scheme Editor here, and I'm going to open my project's grain size scale scheme. So we'll navigate to Tutorial PSICAT, and then in the Schemes folder, there is the default grain size scheme that I used when I created the project. So I'm going to open that, and you can see here we have our 13 grain size entries. I'll close this just for a second, just to show you, there's one noticeable difference about grain size schemes versus other types of schemes. If I change the type here, you can see. So for lithology, for example, we have a name and a code column. For textured, same for all of these, except for grain size, which has an additional column, width. So now let's reopen the default grain size scheme here and look at the values here. So width in a grain size scheme is an integer that indicates the size of each grain size relative to other sizes in the scheme. So relative to each of these entries. We recommend setting the width of the finest grain size to 1 and incrementing for progressively larger grain sizes. And in PSICAT, you can see items in the grain size dropdown here will be sorted by that width value from finest to coarsest, and then none just happens to be at the bottom here. So that will also determine how the items in this list are sorted in PSICAT. And it's also good to understand that the width values here, even if, for instance, if we made them non-consecutive, if we made our boulder width 100 here instead of 13, that would have absolutely no effect on how widely the boulder segment of the grain size scale will be drawn. PSICAT will always divide the scale equally by the number of entries in the grain size scale, which should correspond to the entries in the grain size scheme. So keeping those in sync is really important, otherwise you're going to get unexpected behavior and generally not use the available width in the lithology column optimally. So to demonstrate the interaction between a project's grain size scale, this, and the grain size scheme used by that project, which is this right now, we are going to remove some entries from this scheme, and then we're going to update the scale in our project accordingly. As always, it's best to close the project and PSICAT before modifying a scheme. So I'm going to close this project, and I'm going to quit PSICAT. And we already have the grain size scheme open in Scheme Editor, so we'll just continue. So what I'm going to do here is, suppose my project doesn't have any need of these larger grain sizes, granule through boulder. So I'm just going to remove all 4 of these. And I'm going to save my project. Or excuse me, save my scheme. And now I'm going to return to my project and reopen it. Okay, so I'm reopening my project here. If I open this section, you'll see I used some of the grain sizes I used are now gone. So that must have been one of the larger ones. But if you look at the list now, you can see that now none of the conglomerate entries are there. And if we choose, for this grain size that we lost, let's choose the largest grain size that is now in our scheme, which is sand, very coarse. So when we choose that, you can see that it's still not occupying the full width of the lithology column. And the reason for that, of course, is because if you look at the grain size scale, the project's grain size scale, it still contains these conglomerate items. So PSICAT does not automatically sync the grain size scale to reflect the project's current grain size scheme. That has to be done manually. And so the easiest way to do that in this case would be to go to the project's grain size scale menu and simply remove the same items that we removed from the scheme. So I can do that by just clicking delete grain size. So I've removed those 4. And now if I hit OK, it should update both my grain size scale and the widths at which lithologies of each grain size draw. So now, as expected, our widest grain size item in the scheme now fills the full width of the lithology column instead of only going up to the whatever the last quarter or whatever that was. So again, to see any changes you make to a grain size scheme used by a project, to see those changes reflected in your project and how lithology widths are drawn, you have to update your project's grain size scale to match the scheme. In most cases, it will be easiest to modify the existing CSD facility grain size scheme to suit your project's need. But you can absolutely create your own grain size scheme from scratch. Here's a simple example of creating such a scheme and modifying an existing PSICAT project's grain size scale to correctly reflect that scheme. So I'm going to close this project and we'll go to we'll go to Scheme Editor. And I'm going to close this scheme. So I have in PSICAT, I've created a brand new empty project that uses all the default CSD facility schemes, including the grain size scheme. So if we look in project choose schemes here, we'll see this is the CSD facility default grain size scheme. And so what I'm going to do is create my own new scheme and then remove the default scheme here, and we'll add my new scheme to the project and then see how that works. So go back to Scheme Editor here. I'm going to create a brand new grain size scheme. So we've got new untitled scheme up here, so we're good. So I'm going to give it a name, custom grain size. And as always, that will just automatically populate the ID. You should not need to change that. It's very important that our type is grain size. And again, we notice we have the additional width column here. And so I'm just going to create a very silly, simple grain size scale that has 3 types: small, medium, and large. And you'll notice those don't sort the way we want. I'll just sort them by, actually I won't sort them by name. I'll add widths first and then we'll sort. So we want, again, our relative widths should be integers that are consecutive, starting with 1 for the smallest of those. So I'll have 1 for small here, 2 for width, or medium, and 3 for large. Now if we sort by width, there we go. And then we need to just, let's add textures for these very quickly and arbitrarily, just so they look different. This probably won't make much sense. That's okay. Okay, we won't set colors for these. You could, but there's no need to for this example. So now I'm going to save this scheme. I'm going to save it on my desktop, and we'll just call it custom grain size.jar. Okay. So don't need Scheme Editor anymore. And now I'm going to go to my project, which is currently empty. I'm going to remove the existing default grain size scheme, and I'm going to add the one I just created, which is here. Okay, that looks right. Now I'll click OK. So now I need to create a section here just to edit. So I'm just going to create a simple one from a depth range test. Let's do it from 0 to 1 meters. If we open that section now, let's just add a lithology here. We'll pick something random, like Pete. Okay, now let's add some grain sizes here. So if we select this grain size, we should see, there we go. We have our 3 options here, small, medium, and large, and none, of course, is always available. So if I choose small, it does make the lithology slightly wider. Medium will be wider still. Large, of course, will be the widest of all, but as before, you can see we're not even close to using the full width of the lithology column. And the reason for that is easy to see when you enable, oops, I have to save my section, when I enable the grain size scale in the lithology column. So draw that header. Oops, and we'll make the column wider here so we have more space to see it, and we don't need images here, so I'm just going to remove that and units actually. Okay. So as you can see, as before, our grain size scale is still based on the old CSD facility grain size scale with its 13 entries. So to use our grain size, or to reflect our grain size scheme, which only has 3 entries, we need to update our grain size scale. Now, there are 2 ways you could do this. One way would absolutely be to delete all of the existing grain sizes and add new ones, or delete 10 of these and just update the names of these 3 and use widths 1, 2, 3. But there's a simpler way than doing that all manually. You can derive a grain size scale from the project's grain size scheme. And you do that by clicking Load Grain Sizes. And then you have 3 options here. The default would be this top one, CSD Facility. This option will derive from our current grain size scale. And the fee scale, just to mention it here, is for legacy projects. In the olden days of PSICAT, we used to use the fee scale and a different lithology column where you would enter grain sizes directly for each interval in the lithology column itself. There was no independent grain size column as there is now. So that is used generally for legacy projects. Anyway, back to the topic at hand, deriving from our grain size scheme, I'm going to use this project grain sizes option. And if I click OK, what we should see is it just pulls the names and widths from our grain size scheme. So you can see there, a little narrower, but yeah, so it just took those names and widths and pulled them directly into the grain size scale, which is what we want. So now if we hit OK and use this grain size scale, now there we go. We've got the labels, the widths work properly. The default is always just 20% here. It's a little larger to see that. So this has no parallel grain size here, so it's just taking up the default 20%. And of course we could change that as well if we wanted to use 50% or whatever as default. Now we're using that much more and we only have 3 labels, so they look just fine. So if you're creating a completely custom grain size scheme, the easiest way to sync the project's grain size scale with that scheme is to use the Load Grain Sizes option here and then choose Project Grain Sizes. In general, we strongly recommend only having a single grain size scheme per project. They can technically coexist. You could have multiple grain size schemes, but typically the list is short enough that there isn't really any practical value to having grain size entries scattered across multiple grain size schemes and then loading all of those schemes into your project. It's easiest to just have one, and with the single grain size scheme in your project, you should get the expected results when you use this project grain sizes option. So that's how you would create a scheme completely from scratch and adapt the project scale to use it and reflect it properly. Most users should probably not need this, but that's how it works if you do want to do that. So that's the advanced lithology and grain size interaction tutorial.